Okay, thank you very much, Andy, and welcome everybody to this roadshow presentation. As I've said before, if you've attended one of these Zoom sessions, these are materials that we would have normally presented at an achievement scheme roadshow, which we run around the country. We normally do a couple of locations each year, but obviously under current circumstances, that sort of event is not possible, so we're doing them on Zoom. They've proved very popular so far, and I hope you all enjoy what we're going to and find useful what we're going to do tonight, which is all about multi-rotor and the helicopter BPC and A certificates. As before, I'm joined by several of the Achievement Scheme Review Committee members. There's myself as Scheme Controller, Andy, who you know as BMFA, hopefully know as BMFA Club Support Officer, who has a standing, rather odd phrase, standing seat on Achievement Scheme Review Committee. But we also have Chris Bradbury, the chairman, who's going to be making the presentation tonight, Charlie Cox, Dick Whitehead, John Harris, and Kevin Watson. Have I missed anybody, guys? I think. Oh, and Brian Cooper's here. Yep. So if you all give a wave now, or stick your hands up, everybody will know who the members of the ASRC are. And we're all volunteers. We're just normal BMFA members like you guys. We just happened to put our hands up at the wrong time and ended up on the committee. But we do it because we love it. Everybody's very passionate about the scheme, which is why we're all here tonight. I just hope you find it useful. As Andy said, if there's any pertinent questions while Chris is running through the presentation, don't be afraid to use the features to ask a question. But as Andy's also said, we have plenty of time at the end for us to go into more detail about any particular aspect of the test or whatever. So I'm now going to hand over to Kevin Watson, who's just going to say a little bit about the one of the introductory slides.
Thank you. Okay, good evening everybody. Welcome to this Zoom meeting. Bit of preparatory work for anybody taking any of the achievement scheme tests. Really important that they understand the role of, for example, the instructors. They really get involved in explanation, demonstration, evaluation and practice, but that is both practical and flying skills, and also the questions as well with the candidate. So the instructors have a great role in preparing the candidate for the test. Likewise, the examiner, pre and post test explanation, evaluation, the mock test is really, really useful. That's where you can use your examiner to great potential, get them to get involved in mock testing. Gives experience to all concerned. What about your candidate? You're all here tonight because you want to learn a little bit more, but have you really got awareness of the test requirements? Have you got awareness of the test standards? Awareness and knowledge of safety? And that includes CAA and mandatory type questions. Practice, 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 and then a bit more practice. Simulators can help you as well. Obviously, they're not the real thing, but if you're trying to perfect a maneuver and the weather's bad, it gives you the opportunity to keep your skills going until such time as you can actually fly. Don't forget help and advice. All of the above, official publications, club officials where you actually fly. Don't forget anybody from the BMFA achievement scheme, area examiners or your own examiners, more than willing to give you a helping hand and point you in the right direction. So don't sit there and flounder, speak to us and we will guide you. That's it from me, on to the presentation proper.
Over to you then, Chris.
You don't want to carry on for the moment? Okay. So obviously the test for a BPC or A certificate can be done by any examiner. So if you're a fixed wing based examiner or a rotary examiner or a multi-rotor examiner or a silent flight examiner, any examiner can do any A certificate or BPC certificate, as long as you're obviously comfortable with doing what you're doing. The test must be done basically in one successful attempt, and you're allowed up to 2 attempts in one day. So if somebody fails on their first go, they're more than welcome to have a second go in the day. But obviously, once the test is started, you need to go through the whole test and finish it in one go. The manoeuvres are designed to be done in a specific order. So what you can't do is say, we'll do lazy eights first, then come back to hovering, then do this. It's do the exercises in the order that they're put in the manual. And like I said at the bottom there, maximum of 2 attempts in any one day. So I think next slide, Andy.
Yep.
The A certificate and the BPC, you'll notice a lot of clubs will specify no solo flying without an A certificate. So a lot of clubs, a lot of people will use the A certificate and the BPC as measures of flying ability to a safety standard equating to safe solo flight. Apparently, approximately 50% of clubs use these tests as their solo test from a recent survey. So when you're testing, try and sort of think about the standard of the pilot, not just in terms of how they fly, but how they approach all sort of aspects of safety, model preparation, how they behave around the site as well. So it's not just a test for flying ability, it's a test for general knowledge, a test for behavior as well as flying. The tests for the BPC and the A certificate are exactly the same. So what we mean by that is the maneuvers are the same, the exercises are all done in the same order, the tests, the safety is the same. It's just the aircraft that you would take the test with. The multi-rotor and helicopter are the same at the A certificate. They only vary for the B certificate. So the actual maneuvers that you do in a multi-rotor and a helicopter A certificate are exactly the same. So next one, Andy. So when it comes to selecting your aircraft, I've had the question asked in the past, is say a Chinook, for example, a helicopter or a multi-rotor? So a little bit of common sense has to apply where more than one rotor on a helicopter, it may well still be a helicopter. So contra-rotating helicopters are where you have one set of blades above the top of the other set of blades and obviously going in different directions. They tend to self-stabilize. Normally this is your indoor type helicopter, so they're only available to take the BPC certificate. Essentially, you don't want something that self-stabilizes for the A certificate. A flybarless helicopter, some of the more recent ones will have self-leveling, safe modes where you can hit a button and it will bring itself back to horizontal. None of that can be used for an A certificate. The BPC allows for self-stabilization, but it doesn't allow for altitude control or GPS. So if you can let go of the sticks and the drone or the helicopter sits there in front of you, doesn't go anywhere, then chances are it's not eligible for either the BPC or the A certificate. If you take your hands off the controls and the multi-rotor drifts away with the wind, then but doesn't tip over, then it's probably okay for the BPC. If it slides off into the ground, then it's perfect for the A certificate, provided it's not too damaged from that. The key thing with the stability controls, so flybarless and the free axis gyros and everything else that you get in multi-rotors, the key phrase that we use is flight enabling stabilization. So a drone or a multi-rotor, whichever way you want to call it, they typically won't fly without some form of stabilizer on board. The key thing is that it is only acting to enable flight, not to actually control flight. At any point, if the electronics take over from the pilot, then it's beyond flight enabling, it's something else. So the list there, you'll find those in the guidance documents. If you're thinking of doing the test or taking the test, you can download the guidance documents from the Achievements Team website, achievements.bmfa.org, and you can download the A and the B and so on. And again, the types of aircraft that are applicable are all in there. So Duncan's holding one up on the screen. Thank you, Duncan.
No problem.
Yeah. Okay, so next slide. So yeah, that's the, so someone say, yeah, the multi-rotor there, we kind of covered both in one essentially there. So I think we can skip straight to the next one, Andy, I think.
Okay.
Thank you. Electric or IC, I've not come across many IC multi-rotors. There are a couple out there that use a single motor in the middle and then belt drive to 4 variable pitch propellers. So they do exist. Helicopter-wise, you will get a lot of IC helicopters, you'll get a lot of electric helicopters. It doesn't matter which one you bring to the test. as long as the model can do the manoeuvres that are required in there. The key thing to think about in the differences between electric and IC is obviously that electric powered models are live as soon as the main flight battery is connected. So one of the things you need to watch for if you're testing somebody or if you're taking the test is where you connect the flight battery. You'll find a lot of clubs will probably put this in their rules. So most of the clubs I've ever flown at for helicopters don't allow electric helicopters to have the main flight battery connected in any of the pits areas. So you can connect probably a flight receiver battery and check controls, but not the main motor battery. As mentioned at the bottom there, the model must be suitable to fly the manoeuvres required by the test. One thing you can't do with any of the achievement scheme tests is modify them to suit an aircraft. So if the candidate turns up with a model and says, well, it won't fly in this wind condition, can I get some leniency? The answer is no, it needs to be able to do the manoeuvres as specified. Obviously, if you turn up in this 20-mile-an-hour winds, but the aircraft can fly in the wind, you might want to make a little bit of judgment in terms of how well they flew based on the weather, but you can't modify the test. Next one there, Andy.
Yeah.
The double face plant. This is your favourite one, Andy. Do you want to explain it?
Yes, we added this guidance to all the documents. We wouldn't have thought we would have needed to, but we did after we found out that one particular person who was charging people to teach them how to fly was then taking them for tests using a buddy lead at the end. So clearly it's not appropriate to be on the buddy lead for the test. We're testing the student, not the instructor. So we put that in the guidance. So we always drop that in now. You wouldn't, as I say, think you would need to mention it, but clearly we did. So yeah, moving on.
Yeah,
Chris.
Thanks. Height, speed and positioning. The A certificate for the multi-rotor and the helicopter are all done at the same height for every exercise, essentially, which is 10 feet off the ground, which is probably one of the most common mistakes that you'll see when you do the test. Is most people love to fly their helicopter or multi-rotor between 4 to 6 feet or at eye level. So the first thing you're going to need to do is make sure they're slightly higher than that so that the candidate is almost looking up at the underside of the model. In terms of the exercises, obviously we'll come on to those in a minute. You use ground markers to mark out where the positioning of the manoeuvres will be. I tend to find when I do tests, sometimes the candidates are using natural markers on the field, so for example, the ends of fences on flight lines, for example, bits and pieces like that. But one thing to be aware of if you're taking anything out to mark out for the candidate is don't take something that's going to get in the way. So one of the heli clubs I went to recently, they were putting out 4-foot high cones and saying, yeah, you've got to land on the cone or next to the cone. So I used the little football goal, football practice markers, which are very, very low profile. It says on here for the test, some of the manoeuvres require slightly different speeds. For the ACER, it's pretty much all hovering speed, so around a walking pace and not much more. When you go onto the B certificate, you do then move into full circuit speed and circuit flying, but for the ACER, nearly everything's done at the same sort of pace. So when you set out, the first thing to notice is at the bottom there is the pilot's position. This will be dictated by where the pilot wants to stand. You may well find at a club that there is a pilot's box or somewhere that they need to go and fly. So fixed wing clubs, you tend to have a runway with a pilot box. Some of the heli clubs, they might have individual marked posts where they go out to fly from. So this is down to where the pilot wants to stand. And then the next thing you're going to allocate is the takeoff and landing point, which if you notice on the diagram here, it must be a minimum of 5 meters away. So the idea is the pilot is always going to take off 5 meters in front of themselves. Now, you might need to vary that for club rules. Basingstoke Model Aero Club, where I used to fly, had a club rule that the helicopters were not allowed within 5 meters of the flight line, and the pilot box was then 5 meters behind the flight line itself, giving you a 10-meter distance. So that was always going to be the minimum at that club. But the main thing is that there is a minimum distance of 5 meters between where the pilot stands and the first cone. And ideally, you want to put that first cone straight in front of themselves so that they can look straight through the tail of the helicopter. You then set out 3 further cones, which go across the front from the center marker to one either side, which are all spaced out at 5 meters. And this is for the T-shaped hovering exercise. And then 2 further cones, another 10 meters out, making a 30-meter wide display in total to mark out the ends of the lazy 8s. This will hopefully make a little bit more sense when we go through this a little bit more detail in a second. So the first thing you're going to ask your candidate to do and go through is carry out pre-flight checks. So we're looking for the candidate to look at the key bits that are listed in the handbook, BMFA handbook, what's relevant for any pre-flights for that particular site, and also pre-flight session checks, assuming it's the first flight of the day. So we're looking for fail-safe and range checks. Now, fail-safe and range check on multi-rotors and helicopters can always be a little bit problematic, because people say, well, the only way to do my fail-safe check safely on a helicopter or a multi-rotor is to take the blades or the propellers off. So I'm personally an advocate for doing that, and it depends on the aircraft to a degree. So sometimes with a larger helicopter, you can actually just move the motor slightly. You can undo the screws that hold the motor and move the pinion away from the main gear. That way you can do a power test and switch the motor off without actually affecting the blades in any way, shape or form. Sometimes it will be blades and tail blades off to make sure the aircraft can't go anywhere. Some examiners, I guess, will probably say they'll ask for a description of how it's done and be happy with that. I don't know, what do you reckon, Duncan? Is that something we should say it's down to them, or?
Well, it's examiner and candidate discretion, but the bottom line is I think the candidate has to be prepared to, and they should, a bit like what Kevin was saying at the beginning, they need to have thought through the test, and if they're asked to demonstrate a fail-safe, they should have already, come to the conclusion of really how they're going to do that. What's the best way for them to demonstrate a fail-safe on their helicopter? Is it, like you say, take all the blades off, or is it disengage the motor from the drive, or whatever? So long as they've just done a little bit of prep and thought about it beforehand, just in case they get asked this check, which they'll almost certainly will.
Yeah.
It's something that would be covered in the pre-flight briefing, of course. The
so
examiner and candidate would be talking about this.
Sure.
You would hope the candidate would be switched on enough to raise it actually with the examiner.
Yep.
Right, next one.
Just going back to that previous slide there. So in terms of pre-flight checks, obviously this is one of the key differences now between a helicopter and a multi-rotor. A helicopter tends to have a lot more moving parts. So I tend to go from the top of the head of the helicopter down to the skids, and then the nose of the helicopter to the tail. So you're going through blades and grips and all the linkages and all the moving elements through all the gears, motor, connection, chassis, down to the skids. Then you're going from the front of the aircraft, which is all the electronics, all the way through the tail mechanism to the tail at the back. Whereas a multi-rotor is a lot more compact and everything is kind of just wiring essentially. You don't really have many moving parts apart from the 4 propellers. So, but both of them have the same thing in common, which is making sure that there's no loose wires anywhere to get grabbed out. Okay. So the test. The pilot must stand in the designated pilot position for the entirety of the flying part of the test. So essentially, where we allocate the pilot's position, that's where they stand for the whole test. They shouldn't be walking off following the aircraft or moving to different locations for a better angle. I have had people where they want to do the T-shaped hover, taking a couple of steps to the left so they can stay behind the helicopter the whole time, and then taking a couple of steps to the right. So the idea is they stay still. The takeoff and hover tail in over the takeoff and landing point is essentially the first exercise that they're going to do. So from the center cone, the first cone that you marked out, which is a minimum of 5 meters in front, the first thing they're going to do is take off and hover over the landing point. Rather than talking over this on the slides, Andy, should we talk through it on the video, or do you reckon that will crash on people's webs?
No, that should run okay. We do have a question here from Martin Round, if he wants to unmute himself and ask the question.
Yes, I think, to be honest with that one there, just reading it. Yeah. Is he unmuted?
Are you there, Martin? You should be able to unmute yourself to ask.
Yeah,
oh, there we go.
There we go.
I just asked, with an IC helicopter, you can sometimes just watch the throttle servo moving, switch the radio off, you see it go to the idle position. So you don't actually need to take the blades off or anything, if that's acceptable.
I would say that's acceptable.
That's absolutely fine, yep.
Demonstrating what the fail-safe should be doing.
Yep.
You know, in reality, there's nothing more that you could do to make that engine stop than bringing it back. The electric ones tend to be the bigger issue because obviously there's nothing to see move. It's all, you know, wizardry inside the smoke, inside the box.
Yeah. And we've also got a question from Ian Nelson.
Yeah, hi. Just with that in mind, just thinking through that, even with an electric helicopter, there's a certain amount of throttle movements before the aircraft actually rises, isn't there? So could you take it to that level and then flip the fail-safe in without having to take blades off, etc., etc.? Because of course the thrust of the rotors have to come over the weight of the aircraft. So there's going to be a point when it comes up to perhaps coning angle before actually leaving the ground. So
It's a good question, but the issue there, I think, is what happens if that fail-safe
If it's set wrong, yes.
Yeah, it's going to carry on raising, at which point you've still got a helicopter at full RPM. Does that make sense?
No, I just think before it actually got to, because you actually increase your throttle cycling, increase your, collective, increase until it starts to pump. I hear what you're saying now, the fail-safe's not set.
If it's set incorrectly, it could.
That's the fundamental problem with electric helicopters. Actually, if it's set fine, it's not a problem. But there will be times when it's not been set correctly, unfortunately.
Yeah, there can be a little variation from model to model there as well. If you've got something that has a linear throttle on a more basic speed controller where it goes from 0 to 100, then it might just stop where it is. If you take some of the more 3D aerobatic helicopters, some of them, the moment you give it any throttle, it simulates that's where it needs to now go to 90%, and it will soft spool up. But obviously, if the fail-safe doesn't work, it's not going to stop until it gets to 90%.
Yeah, as I say, this is a plankman asking, so.
That's all right.
It's a good question, but yeah.
I ask you,
yeah,
it's a good question.
Yeah. Right. So the next part of the test then is the horizontal T, which Chris there did a very good job of producing some animations for us. If I can find it, I'm just rattling through this, and we'll go straight to the animation.
Do we have the hover in there as well to start with?
Yep. This is all the way through until the landing after the hovering T.
So you can see you have the pilot position, take off the landing point 5 meters in front, and then the T-shaped cones are separated by 5 meters, and the end cone separated by 15 meters. The first exercise the candidate will have to do is, from the takeoff and landing point, is essentially spool up the helicopter and take off and rise up to around 10 feet, which is, like I say, just over head height, and then hold that position for around 20 seconds. In terms of accuracy, helicopter size will play a small part in this, but essentially I would always advise that you're trying to keep the skids over the obstacle that you're hovering upon. So that's your kind of benchmark for accuracy. You're trying to keep the helicopter blades, not the skids, over the obstacle. So once you've hovered for 20 seconds, you then land basically where you were. Candidate might need to move slightly to one side if the cone is an obstacle, for example, because you don't want to hit the blades on it or blow it away. From that position, you can then take off again and hold over the first cone for 5 seconds before moving forwards 5 meters at a walking pace to the center marker, holding there for 5 seconds. And then you can move left or right. It's the candidate's choice. The examiner doesn't dictate this. Hold over the cone for another 5 seconds before moving back to the opposite extremity of the T and holding there for 5 seconds. Once you've done that one for 5 seconds, you'll then move back to the center marker and hold there. You'll be surprised to hear for another 5 seconds before then reversing backwards to the starter point, so over the takeoff and landing point, holding there for 5 seconds before then performing your second landing. So you've taken off, hovered for 20 seconds and landed, taken off, done a T-shaped hover with 5 second pauses, come back and landed. And that's essentially the hovering exercise is done. So on the illustration on your screen now, you can see that the T-shaped hover is exactly the same for a helicopter and a multi-rotor. There's no difference. It's just one is flying with a multi-rotor, one's flying with a helicopter. Same for the A, same for the BPC. There's no differentiation. The helicopter is always facing forwards with the tail facing backwards. So one of the common things when people drift to one side of the T is they correct the tail as they go. So the tail's always pointing backwards. essentially when the helicopter is at the extremity of the T, it should be slightly fractionally side onto them.
I think I think examiners can to a certain extent help the candidates here. And one of the hardest things ever is to, as I'm sure quite a few of you know, is to look at the helicopter and look at the cone that you're supposed to be over at the same time. It's quite difficult. So I think, I don't think there's anything wrong with the examiner saying, actually, can you move a couple of foot to the left or a couple of foot back or a couple of foot forward or whatever to guide the candidate in terms of the exact positioning. Because what you're looking for is that the candidate can maintain the height and position. So they may well be maintaining the height and position, but not actually over the cone, although they think they are. So you could just give them a small correction to help them, to assist them, might even calm them down just by saying, if you just come back a bit or left a bit or right a bit or whatever. Do you do the same, Chris?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I've just noticed there's a question from Kevin Lammy, if he wants to unmute himself and ask before I move on to common mistakes, which is quite a good question.
Yeah, so when I took my test, we didn't have enough cones, so I utilised a helipad for my multi-rotor, and I talked that through with the examiner, and he seemed to be fine with it as the takeoff and landing.
Yeah, absolutely. The main thing is the takeoff and landing point needs to be a minimum of 5 meters from the pilot. How you mark out the points on the ground is entirely up to you, the individual. I've seen some examiners using a multitude of transmitter cases, whatever they had, putting lipo packs on the floor. One club, they have big traffic cones that are 3 feet tall. I use the little football practice cones because they don't tend to get blown around or moved, but they're also very low profile. So if the candidate accidentally lands too close, they don't either take out their blades, tail rotors, etc. Plus, they are lightweight plastic, so even if they clip the tail, it's the cone that gets shredded.
Yeah.
How you mark out the T-shape and the M cones is a personal choice. There is no right or wrong. The only advice I would give, if you're at a club, because some of the helicopter and multi-rotor clubs that don't do fixed wing don't have a mown runway, so they might well have 1 or 2 foot long grass. So you go and put a cone out, and where's it gone? It's just buried under the grass.
Yeah.
So it's just making sure, and this comes back to what Kevin was saying earlier at the very beginning, when the examiner is talking to the candidate, you discuss exactly what you're using for reference points, so that as an examiner, you can assess how accurately the candidate is flying, but also as a candidate, you know where you should be flying. Yeah. Okay. So now I've got the ability to doodle all over this. Some common mistakes. So for the T-shaped hover, or if I just start actually with I can't draw a circle. There we go. So if I draw a circle there to simulate the rotor of a helicopter, I would be happy with my candidate essentially to be able to keep that disc somewhere over the cone essentially. So with the circle I've drawn here being slightly off the cone, that's when I'd be looking at potentially failing a candidate for drifting too far away from a marker. What I tend to do is, if you have a candidate that takes off and the helicopter moves to one side and then they bring it back, I will start my 5-second countdown once the circle has become, once the disc, as it were, is over the cone and in the right position. Clear all that. Now, the next bit is the figure of 8, the T-shaped hover. The helicopter stays tail in at all times. So the angle of the helicopter doesn't move when you go from side to side. I'm not entirely sure if I can draw a diagonal line here, but if they move over to one side and they keep the tail pointing towards themselves like that, that's when they haven't corrected. So the helicopter should transition completely sideways. What about yourself, Duncan? Do you ever see any mistakes?
No, the only thing I would add is that obviously you'll give the candidate a different degree of latitude depending on the weather conditions. If you've got really windy conditions and it's very blustery, then you're likely to give them more latitude in terms of maintaining the position than you might if it was dead calm. But I think you're quite right, Chris. The most important thing is the orientation of the helicopter.
Yeah. I think some of the mistakes I also see by people learning is when they take off from the first cone, the first maneuver out to the first one here either stops too short or they go way too long. They either misjudge the depth, essentially. This first one here, if they stop too short, when they go for the next cone, when they go to the left or the right, that's when they'll either do a diagonal forwards or potentially a diagonal backwards and again miss the next cone. So you end up with something that no longer resembles a T, even if you try to imagine the T, it just doesn't work. What I tend to say to people when they're practicing for this exercise, if they're struggling to look at the cone or marker on the floor, because it's directly underneath the helicopter and obviously they're potentially looking up at a slight angle unless they're as tall as me or taller, what I tend to say to them is if you can see something on the horizon, so you might find there's a marker over here that might be, say, a large tree, that you can then use your eyesight position to look through to see that. So you can actually then mark something on the horizon and use that as a way of knowing if the helicopter is drifting off position, or the multi-rotor, obviously. That's always a good way of keeping your eye on the aircraft and seeing if it's drifting too much at the same time.
Yeah, a couple of questions there. One from Justin.
Yeah, hi. Just a question there with the tail hold. Most units either use a V-bar. Does that not keep the tail in some sort of heading hold scenario?
Yes, it should, and tail gyros are acceptable for the test. It tends to be people that aren't comfortable looking at the helicopter from a slight angle that correct the rudder as they move it from side to side. So,
force correction. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, a force correction. You know, if you're testing a helicopter and the tail's all over the shop, then you might sit there and think, well, maybe this model's not set up properly. Same as for a fixed wing test, if it's constantly rolling to the right and the pilot's always adjusting to the left, you might think, well, should we be doing a test at this point, or should we be getting the aircraft set up properly? Yeah.
Another very good question from Neil D.
Hi gang, thanks. Great presentation so far, by the way. Yeah, when we do the 5-second hover on each of those phases, does the examiner say, "Yep, carry on," or what's the? How do you know to continue to the next hover?
I tend to count for them primarily because, like I said earlier, if they drift away from the cone and I'm taking a few seconds for them to get back onto the cone, I don't want them cheating and thinking they've done it. Normally somebody as well under the pressure of the test will go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and they're off, and they've only done about 2 seconds. So I tend to sit there in my head. Once I'm happy that the helicopter's in the right position, I'll do the 5 banana, you know, or 1 1000, 2 1000 in my head to get through the 5 seconds. And then I'll say to the candidate, okay, next cone, please, or next position. I also find if I do it as the examiner, it helps the candidate relax an awful lot, because A certificate candidates in particular tend to be at the earlier part of their flying career and can be quite nervous. So if they're trying to count in their head and fly an aircraft and do that, then something tends to be a bit messed up.
Now I do exactly the same, Chris. And I think it's really helpful to the candidate, like you say, if you do I normally cover it in the briefing before we start, but telling them that if they do drift off, I'll ask them to bring it back, and then I start the count.
Yeah.
Or start the count again if
Exactly.
I've got part way through. But if you do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, okay, and then they know to move to the next one, it helps them a lot. The one thing I would say is, surprises me how many people, candidates, present for the test and they haven't practiced with markers.
Yes.
And I would encourage them to do that, because as soon as you put a marker down, it changes everything completely. You suddenly realise you thought that you were actually hovering over a spot, and then when you put the spot down, you suddenly realise that you're not. So I would encourage people.
Why a lot of people practice and fly at 4 to 6 feet so they can see the cones easier on the ground. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Shall I move on to the Lazy Eights?
Lazy Eights.
Lazy Eights.
Yeah, which we've got slides for, but Chris has done another excellent animation. So we shall move straight to that, because they say a picture speaks 1,000 words. I think a video speaks 10,000.
Yep.
So gives you an idea of what we're looking for, and here we go.
So we've got a multi-rotor this time. Now on this one, when you take off, you can transition straight out to the center marker. There's no need to hold over the takeoff point for 5 seconds. But once you get to the centre marker and hold for 5, you can then rotate 90 degrees left or 90 degrees right. Again, this is the candidate's choice. You'll tend to find most of them have a favourite direction they want to move in. And then they do 2 lazy 8s back to back. And the aircraft, as it passes the centre marker, should be side on to the candidate. So what we don't want to see is an aircraft crabbing sideways at 45 degrees with the tail pointing back towards the candidate for comfort. Yeah, we want to see full on sideways. The aircraft should be going at around a walking pace, so it's not fast, it's still a hovering exercise. This isn't a flown figure of 8 and a yank and bank. And you'll also notice, especially if you're a fixed wing flyer, that this figure of 8 is the reverse to the fixed wing figure of 8, as in the center, you essentially come towards yourself slightly, and at the ends, you turn away, not turning in.
I think it's a very different manoeuvre, isn't it? Whereas for the
this is a
fixed
hobble
wing,
exercise.
it's 2 circles to make the 8. The lazy 8 is a very, very different manoeuvre. It's
a squashed 8. So you'll see from the diagram a minute ago, it's not a big circular figure of 8. Essentially what you're doing is moving down to the end cones and gently flying around them. One of the things, or a couple of the things that are important, is that the aircraft is always flying forwards. Just to catch up here, so when you finish, you'll get back to the centre marker, turn back to tail in, hold for 5 seconds, and then reverse straight down to a landing. Again, there's no requirement to hold for 5 seconds over the takeoff and landing point on this exercise. The figure of 8s, though, aircraft must be moving forwards at all times. One of the things that you need to watch out for when they get to the end of the figure of 8 is that they don't stop at the end, pirouette, and then come back. Yeah, the aircraft needs to fly forwards. So on this diagram, hopefully you can see my mouse screen here. As you come down, you go round the cone and back. You don't come up here, stop, pirouette, and then come back.
Common mistakes for the lazy 8s then?
Common mistakes. So common mistakes starting off when they first get out to the centre marker is when they move themselves to 90 degrees and they're side on, they might find themselves drifting away from the centre marker and ending up in a position that's not there. So again, this comes back to what Duncan and I were saying. We might wait for the candidate to position themselves back on the marker before we start the 5 seconds and move off. The other common one is when you come down, so I'm going to see, is there a pen draw tool?
Yeah, there's a, if you click on draw. You want a wiggly line or a straight line?
So the aircraft's going to come off and fly down, and it's going to come round in a nice smooth circle and keep moving forwards all time. Go side on as you go past, and then round. And that completes one figure of 8, and then you do a second one straight away. So common things that I tend to see is that when they come down to the left and they come round here, the aircraft tends to accelerate or run out of speed and stop. So this is partially down to rotor direction and wind speed. So there's 2 key points really, and one is this sort of area and the other is this area, where you're essentially waiting for the candidate to make a suitable adjustment to the speed of the aircraft. The aircraft is either going to want to slow up and stall and stop moving forwards, or it's going to want to accelerate. So if you come around this corner at this left-hand end and the aircraft starts to accelerate, you're looking for them to pull back and slow it down. And likewise, when they get down to this end here, come round, if they find it then stalls for a second, you're waiting for them to keep it pushing forwards again so that it doesn't stop moving forwards.
Yeah, that's my experience as well, Chris. The common fault is usually associated with the turns, and it's either stopping in the turn or just as they come to start the turn, or dropping in the turn, and or accelerating, then trying to draw back the speed, and in doing so stop the model, so you don't get a nice smooth flight. You end up with a little bit stop start, particularly around the turns. I think the interesting thing is with the helicopter and multi-rotor test is they don't specify which way the wind is in relation to the markers, how the course is set out. So it's really dependent on the site conditions, obviously. But if you had a choice, I would always lay this out so that the pilot, in the position we're looking at now on the screen, is actually facing into wind. so that then the two turns at each end are effectively crosswind. So the whole thing's flown crosswind rather than one leg being into wind and one leg being downwind. But of course, that's equally a circumstance that could happen depending on site layout. So, but it's usually associated with the turns as the problems, common mistakes. My experience.
Yeah, I quite often find people have a favourite turn as well. Some prefer turning left,
Yes.
some prefer turning right. So you might end up with a nice gentle figure of 8 here, and then something that goes completely odd on the other end. You know, so you're looking for a nice, consistent sort of uniformity as well. You know.
We have a question there from Craig.
Yeah, Chris, just if I'm using something, I've got a Typhoon, a Q500 Typhoon, so I can disable the GPS and everything, and I could take the BPC as far as I think, correct me if I'm wrong. That aircraft on the transmitter, it's got a variable speed control. So you're talking about flying down and having it at a walking pace and everything else. Is that acceptable in the test to do that, to pull the speed back on that? Because I'm not the throttle, you know, it's like a separate throttle, if you like.
All right. Are you talking some kind of system that limits the maximum speed of the craft?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not come across that one.
It's got a tortoise and hare switch, basically.
Yeah. For the A certificate, the aircraft needs to be in manual.
Yeah.
So something that limits the amount of top speed, that's essentially limiting the amount of pitch or roll that the aircraft can put in, at which point it's not in manual mode. A manual aircraft essentially could be tipped upside down. If you keep holding the roll, it will roll over until it's upside down.
Yeah.
If you let go of the sticks, it will stay banked at an angle.
It'd be acceptable for the BPC, would it?
I think so, yeah. The BPC, it sounds like it's equivalent to DJI's trainer mode on the ATI mode. So, for example, if you take the DJI Mavic, it has a slow mode and then it has a sports mode.
Yeah, same thing.
The problem with the Mavic, you can't switch GPS off. So the Mavic's Phantoms, they can't be used for either of the tests, unfortunately.
Yeah, the one, my Typhoon, you disable the GPS, so you can basically fly it indoor. And then, but I was just wondering, you know, because it's the control over it, because with all the other multi-rotors and everything, it's done by the throttle effectively, so, and the pitch of the aircraft.
Yeah.
This overrides that. It's with it on the tortoise setting, if you like, it limits the amount of pitch and everything that I can have, and I still have full forward flight. If I push forward on the stick, it will go forward. But the more I move,
for the BPC, I don't think it's an issue. The main one for the BPC is GPS, and the self-flying modes. To make a comparison with what you're discussing there and about limiting the roll rate, etc. When we do fixed wing B certificates, there are people that will put the roll of the aileron onto a low rate to do the double roll.
Yeah.
So this is essentially no different. You're just limiting the control of the aircraft to what you need to do for the test. For the Helicopter A certificate, for example, I quite often get asked what's the best setup on my helicopter to do the test. So a lot of 3D helicopters might be minus 10 or 12 degrees to plus 10 or 12 degrees with 0 in the middle, which can make for very pitchy height control. Whereas for an A certificate and somebody learning, I normally set it up at around minus 4 or 3 degrees up to around positive 8, so that they've got enough lift, but also enough negative to pull down on a windy day. But you've now got only 12 degrees of pitch adjustment from the bottom to the top, as opposed to 24 degrees, which makes for a lot finer tuning of the height control. So I don't see limiting the Unique's ability to accelerate to a top speed as any different to that.
No, I'd agree with that, Chris. I think it's as you were saying. The analogy is using setting up rates or flight modes for fixed wing or for helicopter. So it's exactly the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, guys.
Next slide.
Yep.
Yep. We're approaching the end now.
So the end of the test, obviously, is to remove the aircraft and bring it back to wherever they're going to do any work on it. So normally the pits area. The key question as well here is, once they've brought it off, when do you class the model as safe? So electric models, you may well find, need to be disconnected before they're removed from the runway. So particularly helicopters, a lot of the clubs I fly at, again, they don't allow the aircraft to be live in the pits area. So you might find that it needs to be disconnected at the edge of the runway before leaving. Just talking of the runway there very, very quickly, this brings into the whole test is to get the candidate to treat it like other people are flying. You may well find when you do a test or you take a test that a lot of people out of courtesy don't fly at the same time to give you breathing room, time to relax and not be stressed out by other things going on. But as an examiner, we want to see that the candidate knows how to behave, their etiquette. So calling onto the runway, calling takeoff, calling landing. I always say to my candidate, imagine that there are other people flying at all times and treat me like an idiot that knows nothing. Yeah. And the question there is, will you be taking your transmitter onto the runway when you retrieve your model? What do people think on that one?
I think it's a bit of a throwback to the 35 megahertz days, is that one, where it certainly wasn't appropriate to be doing that, especially for the people who are flying. Things have changed a little bit now with 2.4. But again, it should be something that's discussed at the start of before you start the test in the pilot's briefing.
Yep.
And of course, there may well be a club rule in place. We can override anything else. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so next slide, I think.
Yeah.
So the post-flight checks, you'll find with some of these more recent helicopters, I think the Mikado B-bar, for example, actually expects you to switch the model on before the transmitter, which still scares me for some reason. I think I'm old school where I always switch my transmitter on before the model. But what Andy was just saying there, in terms of the examiner giving a proper briefing, this goes both ways. The candidate can brief the examiner on any specific requirements for their aircraft. So in particular with multi-rotors, if they're taking a BPC certificate, there might be multiple flight modes. There is one called compass mode where they can pirouette the aircraft, but left is left and right is right. So there's ways of making sure that the aircraft is doing different things. So ask how they're doing it and what flight mode it's in and so on. Once you're clear and you've done all of that, sorry, I've lost my track there for a second. What was I talking about?
Transmitter on off sequence, Chris.
Yeah, so yeah, just making sure that you understand. So normally transmitter on first and receiver on second, but just be advised there are certain models and also drones that don't do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think 20 years ago, it was pretty much a religious thing that we all did, wasn't it?
It was. It's like the Lord's Prayer. Yes,
yeah,
indeed.
It was, wasn't it? But technology has, well, come on in leaps and bounds, and now there are so many variations. It does make that pilot's briefing at the start between the candidate and the examiner that much more important.
Yeah, you've also got the acronym in the handbook, SMART, so switch on, meter, aerial, rates, transmitter, so that might need tweaking for your individual model.
Yeah, we have a question from Barry. If I can find him too. If you can unmute yourself, Barry.
Andy. Yeah, just a quick one. I mean, given that when we fly indoors in the winter, some of the sports halls were in a sort of full badminton court lengths and wider. Could you actually take this indoors?
I'm going to say no, because we have an indoor specific test for fixed wing, but primarily you're not testing every element of the test in terms of weather.
It specifically says in the standards booklets it has to be taken outdoors. Yeah.
Yep. Right, okay. So there's a specific indoor if somebody wanted to do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
We have a question from Dave Talbot about 1 kilogram distinction here. Dave, can you unmute yourself?
So I realise I can't use Navigator to the test. None of the drones I have are more than 1 kilogram in weight. In fact, the heaviest, which is the Air, is 700 grams.
Yeah. I think you've had
fixed wing only.
I was going to say there's no weight limit for.
Yeah, it's only the fixed wing power A test and B test where there's the weight limit in place. It's not in there for any of the multi-rotor helicopter tests.
Yeah. The only thing I'd say there, just reading your question in the text box, the Mavic Air 2, can you switch GPS off?
you can go into ATI mode, but no, I was already aware that it doesn't fit the spec. So
yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you can put it into a genuine ATI mode and switch the GPS off, then you could do the BPC. It's the GPS that would stop you doing a BPC. But
no,
yeah, the Mavic Air can't do an A certificate, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's not a problem. I'm going to have a small one to play with.
Yeah. We've a question from Richard Wood as well.
Hi, Chris. Just a quick one. Did you say at the beginning that a fixed wing examiner can carry out the BPC and A for a helicopter or multi-rotor?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. Any club examiner can do any A certificate. The only caveat I would put on that is you may well find an examiner doesn't want to do it if they don't understand the discipline well enough. So I do fixed wing helicopters, multi-rotors, gliders. I probably wouldn't do a silent flight thermal one because I just don't understand thermal flying enough to justify giving it the credit as due.
Up to the examiner.
Yeah,
it is examiner's discretion, although they are empowered to conduct any A test.
When it comes to the B certificate, the lead examiner must be in the relevant discipline. So if you're doing a helicopter or multi-rotor test, you need a rotary lead examiner. The second examiner could be fixed wing, or you could use an area chief examiner to do it on their own, essentially, if it's in the right region and area of the country.
Okay. Thanks, Chris.
Okay.
Yep.
Right, next slide.
Yep. So the mandatory questions, which everyone seems to love or hate, it's the Marmite section of the test, isn't it? The key thing to bear in mind, the mandatory questions, they're not new. We've always been asking them. It's just now they're mandatory. With these questions, one of the key things is to ask the question as it's written, in my opinion. So ask it word for word, and then not necessarily expect the perfect answer. So, for example, most common one I get is I'll ask somebody about Article 240 and get the answer to Article 241 or vice versa. So one of the key things I'm looking for when I'm asking mandatory questions is that the candidate actually understands what the meaning is. And if they give me the wording slightly wrong, I'm not too worried. In fact, if I get a parrot fashion answer where they just recite exactly what it says in the question, then I tend to ask them, so what does that mean? Because they might have just memorized 23 answers and not have a clue what any of them actually mean.
Yeah, we're looking for understanding, aren't we? That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And the guidance actually says that the candidates aren't expected to be word perfect.
No.
And just a little bit of mandatory question history and trivia. There was when they were introduced, which is a good few years ago now, there was a lot of concern that they would put people off the scheme. The year following the introduction of the mandatory questions, there were a significantly greater number of tests within the scheme than there had been in the previous year.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a urban myth that they've put people off taking tests. In fact,
I think 2016 they came in, didn't they?
Yes, yeah, 2016. Thank you, Andy.
I think the ASRC showing incredible foresight there, bearing in mind what the CA have come up with this past year.
Yeah, those pesky copycats.
Yeah.
And then obviously the other part of the theory is 5 supplementary questions based on the BMFA safety codes for general flying and the club itself. So questions you might ask might be, where you can't fly at a specific site, bits like that. But it all comes essentially from the handbook or their club rules. Does anybody want to chip in on that from the ASRC?
I think just bear in mind it is a minimum of 5 if you're
not
convinced that the candidate has shown enough, or you still want to satisfy yourself of the candidate's understanding, you can ask more than 5.
Yeah.
I think it's also important that you can explore an answer if the answer is not the way you would like it. Explore the candidate's understanding.
Yeah,
Make sure they have got it right.
That's a great technique, Kevin. That's a really good idea. You just keep probing until you run out, really. But that's great.
Yeah, we had a question, didn't we, on one of the previous sessions about how to deal with somebody that was profoundly deaf. Just as some of the scenarios, I flew at a helicopter club down in Farnham, which had a very high Polish membership. So English wasn't their first language. So sometimes you can ask a question and just get a glazed look back at you. So you might sort of have to rephrase it into a slightly different wording and then ask it again. And get a slight answer and then go, okay, can you expand on that more? And by just asking them different questions or similar questions, you can actually get the information you want. And they may well understand it, but they just don't know how to necessarily phrase it. A bit like me waffling tonight doing this talk.
Yeah. Right, and last slide then.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing to remember is we do this for fun. The achievement scheme is voluntary. There's no compulsory need to do it for the BMFA's insurance or anything else like that. But the key thing to anybody, if you're an examiner or a candidate, is to read the standards guidance booklets and watch the videos. There's a very good video that we put online. I'm very biased because I'm in it, where we talk about the types of drones, how to tell if the drone is self-stabilized, GPS and programmed and so on. So trying to identify what type of aircraft you have and what can be used for the different tests. So that's definitely worth a good look and a good watch. It's about 30 minutes long, I think, isn't it, in total?
Yes, yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Just under a half hour.
Do dedicate yourself half an hour prime time. So whilst the wife's watching EastEnders, you can watch the much more interesting video.
Yeah, they're all on the BMFA YouTube channel. There's quite a few there, as are all these presentations that once I've edited them slightly, they get chucked up on the BMFA YouTube channel, so you can always refer back to them.
Kevin's got his hand up.
Question from Kevin there.
Yeah, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so when I took my A test, it was with a 5-inch, what we would class as a mini quad, but there doesn't seem to be any documented or documentation about the size limit of the quads you can use. So, you know, as we know, there's various different types out there now.
Yeah. The fixed wing has a 1 kilo minimum and the requirement to roll off ground. The multi-rotors and the helicopters, where are we?
Yeah, there's no weight limit.
Yeah,
but it has to be flown outdoors.
Yeah,
yeah.
So there's in my hand a nano helicopter, which probably weighs in the region of 60 grams, and it's about 8-9 inches long.
Yeah,
it's a full manual helicopter. It can be flown in the right direction. The limitation for this is if I want to fly it outside on anything other than a light, gentle breeze, it's going to disappear. And also, bearing in mind, I've got to fly this thing over 15 meters away from myself,
yeah,
and then get visual orientation issues. The same thing is going to happen with very small micro quadcopters.
Yeah.
You know, the moment you get to 15 meters away, the orientation is going to be a nightmare.
Yeah.
I think the weight category is self-restricting in that respect.
Yeah. We do our best to be as open and make
inclusive.
Inclusive. That's the word I was. Thank you, Chris. The word I was looking for. Yeah. So that people can have there's lots of different things to choose from to be able to fly the test. Obviously within the limits of the test, but
yeah.
Anybody? Any questions? You're all free to unmute yourself as and when required.
A good question there from Justin on the size of the helicopter for a test.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got helis from all the way from 150 all the way up to 800. Is bigger always better because it's more stable in the wind?
Well, the test has to be flown outdoors, and we live in the UK where there's always some wind. A flat calm is very unusual. So the simple answer to your question would be yes, I guess. But it's really whatever machine you feel comfortable with.
I find the most common,
most important,
tend to be 450 and 500s, or then it's up to the 600 size. And I find that I meet two different types of people. Someone who likes the stability of the bigger helicopter, but then you also get the next person who is scared of the size of it and prefers the small one. So, yeah, but there's no right or wrong really as such.
No.
Any more questions from anybody?
Does that help, Justin?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. I just in my experience, I find the 600 is the sweet spot for the practicing I've been doing. It's so much more stable than the squirrely 450 or 500s.
Yes. Yeah,
definitely.
I think the important thing was, as Duncan says, whichever one you're most comfortable with is the answer to the best aircraft to use.
Good question. Great question from Barry, actually, because we've been discussing this over the last couple of weeks.
Thanks.
Yeah, just interested, thoughts about bringing in a Mavic style. We've got a lot of members of our club who have Mavics or that type of drone, mainly Mavics, one form or another.
We've discussed it for about 2-3 years now in total, Duncan.
Yeah,
Along those lines?
yeah. There are several fundamental problems. But probably the biggie is it's difficult to come up with a flying challenge, because the whole underlying ethos of the scheme is to provide a challenge and goals for people to aim for to improve their flying.
Yeah.
And the problem with with modern multi-rotors, with all the various stability modes and other sort of flight planning options, it's difficult to come up with a scheme, any form of test that actually challenges the flying. And if you say, well, okay, then you've got all the real challenge in my head is understanding the system, that everything that the multi-rotor is capable of, and getting the best out of it. But then you're into looking at, how well the candidate has actually set the machines up, and that will be different from one manufacturer to another, and we can't make tests that favor one manufacturer over another. So you can see why we've been talking about it for 3 or 4 years and got nowhere with it.
Yeah.
I don't, the other guys will chip in as well, I'm sure. So
I was just going to say,
other than
a little bit of my background is
hovering, other than hovering, you've still actually got to fly a Mavic if you actually want to do a proper figure 8 or something like that. We're not on about using Lychee to set up a waypoint for you or anything like that. You still need to actually fly the thing around. I don't know if there's more flying agility or flying ability type tests that can be introduced rather than the sort of sideways movement and hover.
Yeah, it's been discussed multiple times. My background is I'm a commercial drone pilot. I do TV and air filming with drones. Essentially, that's what I do for a living, and I fly multi-rotors, helicopters, gliders, fixed wing, everything as a hobby. So there is a lot of sort of that process in there, and I'm quite aware of the aircraft. The biggest issue we've had over the last few years, I think, is probably just keeping up with technology as the aircraft come out. The Mavic probably being one of the biggest to come out with everything on board, including anti-collision, tracking, waypoint adjustment and everything else. One of the biggest things that's at the heart of the achievement scheme, though, is creating something that is a test of pilotability and something for personal aiming for and personal growth. It's not about writing tests to satisfy clubs so that somebody can fly unsupervised. A lot of clubs will adopt that as a way of measuring it, but that's not what the scheme is for. One of the issues we've had with these modern aircraft that are coming out with every gizmo available on is, how do you write a test that isn't testing electronics but is testing a pilot? So one of the things we're potentially looking at, and we haven't decided, it's still up into the air, is creating something as a guidance to clubs. So for the clubs that might be insisting on somebody having an A certificate, and then you've got the guy that turns up with the Mavic who can't do the A certificate, how does that person fit into a club? So we want to try and help and get that evolved and move something with that, but we're in the process of it.
That was the ethos behind the introduction of the BPC, to cater for a lot of the aircraft that are out there now that aren't going to meet the requirements of the air test. And then, of course, DJI come along and bring one out where you can't turn GPS off to. And this is the problem: technology moving a lot quicker than people expect on that one. So.
But I think it's fair to say we'll keep an open mind and we'll always review it going forward. But for now, as Chris has pointed out, we think the best way forward will be to look at some sort of guidance for clubs as much as anything else, because it's generally more of a club problem than an achievement scheme problem, if that makes sense.
Just before I move on to a question from Eric, just something to add to this point as well. It's the same for every test that's available, is the test cannot be modified to suit the aircraft. So if you take a fixed wing B certificate where you have to do a bunt, you'll get somebody with a scale aircraft who says my aircraft can't bunt, but you can't modify the test to do that. So for every test that is available, you have to present with an aircraft capable of doing the maneuvers as they're set out in the document. So Eric, if you want to read out your question.
So what is the process for becoming an examiner? The reason for asking is that I'm interested in getting the drone racing community better represented in the achievement scheme. But although drone races tend to meet in large numbers when there isn't coronavirus around, and quite regularly, getting examiners at the same time and location is quite difficult.
A great one for you, Duncan.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, first off, we actually covered the process in one of the earlier presentations, but I'll quite happily talk you through it. Basically, your club has to identify suitable candidates. They have to have a B certificate, and then all your club does is contact your area coordinator, who will make arrangements for an area chief examiner to come and examine the candidate or candidates. So it's a relatively straightforward process. There's no reason why it can't happen reasonably quickly, and it can happen under the sort of current conditions we've got under lockdown. But in the short term, if you have any, I don't have a problem with you contacting either myself or Andy or any other members of the ASRC, and we will do our best to come along when conditions allow at a meeting, and to sort of get the ball rolling and talk people through the process, one to one.
In terms of a B certificate as well, Duncan.
Yes, yeah, they do have to have a B certificate in the particular discipline. So that's probably the critical thing, because it's a bit of a catch-22 situation. Well, if we've got no examiners in the club, how do we get a B certificate? So that's where interaction with your area coordinator and your area ACEs, or us, or myself, or Andy, or Chris, or any of the other members of the ASRC, will do our best to get you up and running so you can become self-sufficient. I think that's the important thing. Does that all make sense? Sorry, it's a bit long and waffly there. The process is described in the Achievement Scheme Handbook, which is a downloadable document from the website. But I think a bit of swapping personal contact details, we can go a long way there, Eric, to helping you out.
I think you should also be able to find an area chief that could come out for a day and visit the club and do it. I did it for Skylarks when I was in the south. They were adopting multi-rotors. I went down and did 7 A certs and a B certificate in one day.
Yeah.
So as long as the examiner gets to fly, you're normally flying. They're quite happy to come down and spend a day at another club.
Yeah. Once the ball's rolling with the multi-rotor examiners, it will pick up, won't it? And it's just a case of getting that effort in to start off with, to get people through the A's and the B's. And then the examiners will start appearing.
Yeah, it's about the self-sustainability. That's where I'm coming from.
Correct. Yeah, that's the critical thing.
Yeah, it's getting to that point, isn't it? Which, of course, we'll do everything we can to
absolutely
to do.
Yeah, that's the most important thing.
Yeah. While we've got Eric, of course, who is very well known in the drone racing community, we are looking at an FPV racing specific test, aren't we?
Yeah, there's an FPV extension already out and about that can be applied to an A fixed wing or an A multi-rotor, or an A heli if you really want to do FPV with a heli. But there is also an FPV racing extension for the A certificate that's been written. We're just basically waiting for the chance to test it. Unfortunately, COVID has kind of locked us all down from being able to do it, but it's in the process.
Great, that's good to hear.
Yeah. We're keen
to get the FPV races and the multi-rotor guys.
Well, I think Eric's probably want to get on board for that, to be honest. So we can.
Well, Andy, Eric, are you happy to swap all your details? Well, I'm sure Andy's got all your details.
I've got all the contact
already.
Details, yeah.
And we'll pick this up and run with it from ASRC. This is in terms of getting you some examiners, so you can. Because in theory, a B certificate holder has to have the B certificate for 6 months before they're eligible to become a club examiner. But there have been under special circumstances there, and the precedent has been set that can be waived. So we can do our best to get you up and running ASAP. So that's one we'll pick up outside of the meeting.
Yeah, I can probably put Chris
another
in
question
contact
there
with Eric. I think we've missed a question from Anthony Hart, actually.
Yeah, certainly. My question was quite a simple one, really, in terms of height deviation when you're taking a test. What would you allow generally, talking to all the examiners on the call, what would you allow generally in terms of height deviation as you carry out your lazy 8 and your hovering manoeuvres?
Depends on the wind conditions.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also I would, and I bet the other examiners the same, I would talk to the candidate and say, you're a little bit low, you're a little bit high, or whatever. And so one of the techniques that I use, and I'm sure the other guys do as well, is if you make a comment to a candidate and perhaps suggest a correction, and they can take it on board and don't make the same mistake again, then that's to me, that's a strong indication that the candidate's on top of the game and has practiced and is in a good position and, you know, is more than likely to pass the test. Whereas if you have a candidate who repeatedly makes the same mistake, even after you've asked a correction and or perhaps made a suggestion, then that again tells you something that perhaps the candidate isn't at the right stage. But there's no simple answer to your question, unfortunately. And for me, it depends very much on the wind conditions. But
also the size of the aircraft as well. I think sometimes with helicopters, the small ones will bounce around up and down a lot quicker than the bigger ones.
Yeah, and I suppose you're really looking for correction of the aircraft to keep it at a suitable height more than the height itself. It's more the correction.
Yeah, in fact, if you can be, if the candidate is being self-critical and says to me, "Oh, terribly sorry, you know, there's the wind dropped there and the model moved or whatever," and then again you get that sort of feedback is comforting.
Yeah. Cheers, guys.
One of my favourite questions at the end of the test is to ask the candidate, "How do you think?"
How
do
they do?
Yeah, and see what they say and see what they've noticed about themselves, and see if they turn into someone from Formula One when it comes to excuses.
We have another question there from Kevin.
Yeah, it's just about the if you're going to do a road social session for the Heli and Multi-Rotor B test.
More than likely, I would have said.
Yeah.
We're happy to take any suggestions for any presentations going forward. So if it's requested, we will do our very best to cater for it. Definitely.
In fact, next week's presentation came from a suggestion from last week's presentation. So we love a little bit of feedback.
All right, any more questions, anybody? No, everybody happy? Well, I think we finished in that case.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
for tolerating my waffle.